Greetings, colleagues, fellow teachers and educators around the world. I'm Nikos Sifakis. On today's Everything English Language Teaching, the interesting differences between written and spoken discourse. Why is this topic worth talking about? Why concern ourselves with these so obvious differences, right? And why bother? Well, the quick answer is because they are not what they seem at first glance. Okay, so let's get right into it. For the average person, and by average I mean someone who is not linguistically trained, speaking and writing are two completely distinct areas. Their main difference is that speaking is whatever comes out of our mouth as speech, and writing is related to products of the pen, the pencil, or the keyboard. The very act of producing spoken and written discourse makes the former, speaking, more spontaneous, relaxed, and therefore informal, and the latter, writing, more prepared, and therefore formal. That's the so-called layperson's perspective. But is this perspective right? Well, not exactly. Typically, the act of preparing a written text has very specific characteristics. The main feature of writing is that we have the time to prepare it. We have the idea, we can formulate it in the appropriate or expected way, we can revisit it, revise it, edit it, improve it as much as we want. We can use word processing software and different fonts and sizes, bold types and italics, titles and headings, paragraphs and spelling conventions to make sure we communicate exactly what we want. We have time. The final product comes sometime after the will to produce it, and this makes a lot of difference. This is also very helpful from the point of view of the reader, the receiver of the written product, who also has some time to read or process the written text, to process the information, to go back and reread any part or even the whole of the text as necessary. This also means that one of the main features of written texts is what is known as density of information. Written texts typically have more information in them than spoken text, right? So what's the deal with spoken texts? Well, we all know that spoken texts are produced in real time, which means that speakers generally do not have the time to prepare a lot for them, in the same way that they do when producing a written text. Anything that we say through our mouths requires the passage of time, which means that any improvements we make to it, any rephrasing or paraphrasing, any corrections or any clarifications will require time. When we speak, we cannot go back and delete or edit what we've just said. Also, as spoken communication happens in real time, we have to seriously consider our interlocutors. Do they understand what we say? Is our speech intelligible? Can they understand, in other words, the sounds and the words we produce? If not, perhaps we should speak slower. Is our speech comprehensible to them? Can they understand the lexical meaning of these words? If not, then perhaps we ought to choose other words, words that they can comprehend. And finally, is our speech interpretable to them? Can they understand the meaning of the words that we use within the specific context that we are using them? If not, perhaps we should make sure exactly what we mean by these words. We cannot edit our speech in the same way we can with writing, but we can do other things. We can increase the volume and change the rhythm, speak louder or slower, stress certain points, and so on, as the case may be. Because spoken communication takes place in real time, its density of information is lower. We have to take in the other person's understanding of what we are saying, which means that we cannot pack our talk with a lot of information? What if there's noise, or what if the other person is sick, or on the phone, and so on? We have to take all this into consideration. Well, what we've just said proves that writing is different to speaking. They are two completely separate and different beasts to be mastered, right? Well, yes and no. What happens, for example, when we have to give a speech or a lecture in front of an audience? For sure, the text is spoken, but that speech is not entirely spontaneous, is it? And we know that there are lectures and lectures. Some are more prepared than others. Some lectures may have many of the features of written texts. They contain heavily pre-modified phrases, for example, complex noun phrases. They use passive voice constructions typical of written speech, and it is sometimes desirable to keep a record, an audio or video record of them, so that they may be reproduced and reattended at will. And what happens when we make a deposition in a court of law? We are under oath, so we'd better be very careful about what we say. This is not the time to be creative or spontaneous, as we usually are when we speak. Or to take a completely different case, what happens when we are waiting in line at the bank and the only thing we want to do is to ask the cashier to carry out a very specific transaction for us? Again, speech is very different in all of these cases. In the case of the bank transaction, we don't have to talk too much. In fact, it's not expected of us at all. This is not a leisure activity. We can spend a second to perhaps joke with the cashier, say about the weather, but there are people waiting, so we'd better be quick with our transaction. All of these are examples of spoken interactions that have the features of written speech. Formal talk, lack of spontaneity, careful planning, very specific expectations of what needs to be said. These are typical features of written discourse. But sure enough, the same happens the other way round. We have written texts that have features of spoken texts. For example, certain emails we send, we have to write quickly without the time to edit them. The same is true with SMS messages. The same with social media chatting. All these are created and sent in real time, without editing, without using any of the features available to written texts. So, what's the bottom line for teachers? We are told to teach speaking and writing in specific ways, and it's true that speaking and writing are two very different language skills with their own idiosyncrasies and challenges. But at the level of text or discourse, the boundaries between speaking and writing are not as clear-cut as we think. In fact, as we've seen, they can be very complicated. What we need to understand is that spoken texts and written texts are not always the same kind of texts. In fact, it's better to see the similarities and differences between written and spoken discourse in the form of a series of continua or different dimensions rather than a straightforward binary distinction. In her discussion of the topic, Maria Sifianou refers to categorizations made by Biber and Gradel and others, and mentions the dimensions of transitoriness, the extent to which a text is permanent or not, degree of formality, formal as opposed to informal, the use of standard English, comparing, for example, BBC News, parent-child conversation, or non-native speaker conversation, the degree of interaction between producer and perceiver, is the interaction message-oriented or socially oriented, and the dependence on context, which speaks for itself. In other words, the context can shape the typical discourse used. So, what's important to remember when teaching writing and speaking? is to raise your learners' awareness of the complex reality surrounding written and spoken texts, and to remind them that in our mother tongue, in the foreign language, and in any language, we use speech and writing to serve a purpose, to address an audience, and to meet a specific need, and that purpose, audience, and need demand a very specific mixture of elements to make it efficient and effective. In discourse analysis and education, that mixture is known as genre. Exposing our learners to the many, many different communicative contexts where these different genres are used is one of the central purposes of teaching and learning a foreign language. I will add the references to the books and articles that I mentioned in this video in the description below. Check them out. I hope they are helpful. As always, thank you for watching, and I look forward to communicating with you. Bye for now.